Not long ago, 23andMe was a bright star in the innovation firmament. It had caught the zeitgeist. It was bringing the new age of technology into the hands of ordinary people to enrich their lives. It was an all too brief moment of promise. Instead, its fortunes fell rapidly. A company that had been worth $6 billion has become essentially worthless, by which we mean about the same value as the cash it has in the bank. Recently, the entire board, save for the founder, resigned en masse, complaining at the lack of progress towards any sort of plan to move things forward. A massive fall from grace, you might say, and underpinning the demise of what could have been a great company is a real dilemma that is often missed when people are talking about it. We'll cover that dilemma at the end of the video, but first, let's look at how it all unfolded. We've become so accustomed to the knowledge of what is human DNA, how it defines us, how its occasional mistakes can be our downfall, it's easy to forget just how recent its discovery actually was. Just 71 years ago, Francis Crick and James Watson discovered the double helix structure of DNA, and it was a massive breakthrough in scientific understanding. It explained how our genetic information is coded, how it replicates, how genes get passed down from generation to generation. It took a couple of decades from that initial discovery for us to get to the point where we fully sequenced a DNA genome. That first one was completed in 1977. It was the DNA of bacteriophage X174. The second was 7 years later, the DNA of the Epstein-Barr virus, which was found to have 172,282 nucleotides, which sounds like a lot. I mean, kind of is a lot, unless you consider that the human genome has over 3 billion nucleotides, which is why the very first time a human genome was successfully sequenced around the turn of the century, it cost more than $95 million to do. But the collapse in the cost of testing DNA has been breathtaking, and you can now get a genetics testing laboratory to analyse your genome and send you a useful and interesting report for as little as $99. And this was the big promise of 23andMe when it was launched as one of the world's coolest startups back in 2006. I mean, it had everything. An exciting new technology, sure to transform our understanding of the world. It had close connections with what was described as Silicon Valley royalty, namely that the company's co-founder and CEO, Anne Wojcicki, was in a relationship with, and would go on to marry, by the way, Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google. And indeed, Wojcicki's sister, Susan, was Google's first marketing manager and would go on to become the chief executive of YouTube. Unsurprisingly, Brin and Google were early financial backers of the company. So it had zero trouble raising $1.4 billion to fund the creation of its direct-to-consumer DNA testing business. You could send the company a small amount of your saliva,
this big spit party,
and get back test reports talking about your ancestry and your exposure or not to certain genetic health risks. It got huge amounts of celebrity endorsements in those early years. Oprah Winfrey placed it on one of her favourite things lists, and various models and actors and rock stars added their stamp of approval. The excitement arguably went all the way through to 2021.
23andMe making its trading debut today, going public on the NASDAQ via SPAC merger. And let's take a look at shares opening late this morning at $11.13. The company raising about $592 million in proceeds.
When the company listed on the NASDAQ exchange via a special purpose acquisition company backed by Richard Branson, and its valuation topped $6 billion. In an interview on the Freakonomics podcast at a point when the company was riding high, host Stephen Dubner put it to Wojcicki the amazing success he attributed to her. She had talked about the origin story, where she was disgusted with how Wall Street monetized illness.
So by pursuing a vision that is about a solution and that doesn't monetize illness, you started a company that's now valued somewhere around between $2 and $3 billion. Is that about roughly right?
You know, it's kind of the least of my worries. Like, valuations are always important, but to me, the ultimate financial success, when I can point to, like, hey, like 20 million people didn't die in their 40s because of me, then I'll feel like, yeah, that's worth bragging about.
Wojcicki was to find out just how important valuations can turn out to be a very short time later. And it was going to test to destruction that set of priorities for social benefit over raw profit. What does it mean, that line about the monetizing of illness as relating to the pharmaceutical industry? Well, it's a reference to the fact that for an industry whose products include those designed to save lives and to alleviate human suffering, a mission which you'd think would bring it with a high societal esteem and reputation, in fact, we most often view Big Pharma as the baddest of all the bad guys. Yes, their products alleviate suffering, but Big Pharma is less interested in solving problems once and for all than it is in alleviating symptoms on an ongoing basis, because there's way more profit to be had in that market. And in providing what get described as lifestyle drugs, of which the new generation of weight loss drugs are just the latest version. Lethal diseases suffered mainly by poor people? Well, not so much. Some token gestures supported by governments or maybe by the Gates Foundation. But really, the business model for Big Pharma is that rich people get sick and need expensive drugs to feel better. As a society, we would be more well if we lived better, avoided bad habits, understood our genetic makeup and what were our biggest risks so that we can manage them before they become a problem. But it's a lot harder to turn that into an ongoing profit stream. This is where 23andMe came in. Its private genetic testing model gave you very useful information about at least some of your potential health issues, as well as some other fascinating stuff about your ancestry. The key problem was it's a one-hit wonder to obtain all the value from that interaction. Once you've had your first report about what your DNA tells you, well, you've had your report on what your DNA tells you. Thank you for the service. Goodbye. Why would I need to buy from you twice? 23andMe responded to this challenge with the same solution that software providers do, to try to turn their one-off product into a subscription service. Software makers struggled with this. If people bought their software, they could then offer paid upgrades, but if the old version does everything that I already want, then I might, and usually did, conclude that I would pass up this upgrade. Thank you very much. So they changed it. So the only way the software would even work on your computer would be if you had a live subscription. It annoys their customers no end, but it's arguably justifiable in principle given the nature of the product. But in this case, my DNA is not going to stop working if I don't pay 23andMe. Not yet, anyway. So although the company created its subscription product, tried to make its best case that regular updated reports would give you even more useful information to guide your health and wellness journey, its projections of this product turned out to be massively over-optimistic, because the sales pitch just wasn't that convincing. So the other way it had of creating value was the fact that having a repository of data from 15 million users, of whom 80% had consented to share their anonymized data, they had something potentially highly useful for the research of new drugs. You know, by Big Pharma, those people monetizing illness. So initially, 23andMe started working with GlaxoSmithKline on the potential for immuno-oncology drugs. An antibody that counters advanced solid tumours went into clinical trials, and other drug targets were identified. The problem here is one of timescale and of rate of success. Many proposed drugs fail clinical tests, they are not shown to be effective, or they are shown not to be safe. Even assuming it goes well, it can take a decade for a drug to go through trials to the point where it becomes approved. In the meantime, virtually all the company's revenue comes from the direct-to-consumer business, the traditional 23andMe fare, and it's saddled with that basic structural flaw. It just doesn't make a profit. Its loss for the most recent fiscal year was $176 million. Its value since its highest point has plummeted. But arguably, it wasn't only the basic flaw in the business model that really did for 23andMe. There was also an element of hubris that ran squarely into the high-trust nature of that social mission. We're going to talk about that next, but if you're still here, this would be the time to do an equally one-time transaction, namely hit the like button and hit that subscribe button and notification bell to be informed of future content. Like 23andMe, you only have to do it once. Unlike 23andMe, it's completely free, but also it won't tell you anything about your great-grandparents. Sorry about that. So, 23andMe had a big problem with its business model, as we've discussed. Its CEO was on record as saying that the most important thing for her was the impact it might have on people's health, not just its valuations. But as one chief executive I used to know would say, you can't change the world if you don't balance the books. And so it was. But also, the very nature of 23andMe's business depended on something else that was crucially important. What was that thing? Trust. After all, your DNA information is kind of deeply personal to you. Once you've handed it to a company, it is pretty clearly out of your control what happens to it. And it's very easy to imagine ways in which profit-seeking corporations could end up using that information against you. One obvious one would be insurance companies, who might not insure people against health impacts that have been made more likely because of their DNA profile. Now, in the United States, there's a 2008 law called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which is supposed to protect citizens against discrimination by, for example, employers and health insurers on the basis of genetic data. But there are rather important exemptions. Providers of life, disability and long-term care insurance enjoy those exemptions, and that could come back to bite you. Suppose you have a genetic marker that says you're going to be more susceptible to heart conditions. A life insurance firm could find that out and decide to deny you a life insurance policy. So yes, the trust you need to have towards 23andMe to be assured that such consequences will not follow your simple act of sending them some of your spit, well, it's quite large. So you might be concerned that, unlike your doctor, 23andMe is not constrained by the health privacy law HIPAA. 23andMe knows it needs new ways to create value, and it knows that it has all these valuable data, so the pressure is on them. Now, the company has promised that it will ask its customers permission before using their data for research or indeed for targeted advertising or anything else. Ignore the fact for now that corporations have been known to make promises and then just break them when the incentive comes along. The fact is that the company is in a perilous position. And if it were to be bought out in the future, the new owners would likely have very different ideas about how to use all that DNA data to benefit the bottom line. The company's privacy policies, which of course nobody reads before using the service, make it clear that in the event of a merger or acquisition, customer data is a saleable asset. The spokesperson from the company told The Atlantic recently that it was true that the company couldn't fully guarantee the sanctity of customer data, but it said that any such scenario would be, quote, carefully considered. You know, as in, we carefully considered this and decided to do it anyway. Or at least you might suspect so. So it's easy to see how all of this becomes a hideous downward spiral for 23andMe. Not only does the company have a product that at its core is a one-time only lifetime purchase, not only have its attempts to transform that into a regular service been underpowered, since the real value of updates is perceived by most people as very limited, but also the pressures for the company to break its promise of privacy are then there for everyone to see, and right now, when it's struggling and it needs most to retain customer support, there's lots of speculation about how that data might end up being used, some might say abused. So what's the takeaway from all of this? This is the flip side of that idea that the company is on a social mission, which is held to be more important than the mere company valuation. The brutal reality is these two cannot be treated as being wholly separate in that way. Companies can absolutely make the world a better place thanks to the benefits of their products and services. You have to find a way to do so that works with the grain of a successful business model, not wholly separate to it, or even worse, in opposition to it, in tension with it. Right now, would anyone watching this video be well advised to use any genetic testing service? Well, maybe in California, where the law gives them added right to download their data and delete their accounts. Maybe. But this is one area where you'd have to say it would really pay to do what no one ever wants to do and read the fine print. Consider very carefully the worst case scenarios of how your data could be used before sending your spit through the post.